Hi, in this video, we're going to be covering a paper that I read a few weeks ago, and it's about conservation efforts towards the southern resident killer whales. Now, we did record this, me and Gio, we did record this as part of the podcast, like a little bit of an extra thing at the end of the last podcast. However, I wasn't too happy with some of the bits where I was explaining this paper, so I decided I'm gonna re-record some parts of it, and also gonna intersplice some of the actual recordings that we did with Gio. So this is a paper by Michael Ford et al. And this was first published on the 5th of March 2026. And it's called Perspective. The future of the southern resident killer whales depends on interactions with other killer whale populations. So, what this paper does is it correlates a lot of discussion topics from other papers by other people and pulls them all into one for the purpose of maybe suggesting that in we're not looking enough at other populations of orcas in the same geographical region as the southern residents. So, for instance, the Alaskan residents, the offshore orcas, the northern residents, and also the big orcas, which the southern residents are in the same kind of area, even though their range doesn't overlap with the Alaskan residents. They do overlap in some part with the offshores, the bigs, and the northern residents, but they're all part of the same kind of ecosystem. And one of the biggest things that this paper suggests is that our efforts on increasing salmon reproduction, increasing the salmon population, might not have as big an effect as we think. That isn't to say it's not having an effect. It's not to say that we shouldn't be trying to boost salmon numbers, but that we might not see as big an impact as we think. And they gave the reasons that because the salmon will go north towards Alaska, when they come back and they're big, they'll go there when they're young, and then when they come back and they're big and juicy for an orca snack, um, that population of salmon that's coming back through will be predated upon by the offshore orcas, be predated upon by the Alaskan residents and also the northern residents as well before they even reach the southern residents. So the amount of new salmon there are might that not all of that is going to come back to the southern residents, and this is maybe arguing that perhaps we need to have more research onto like maybe there's certain salmon from certain rivers. This is my speculation. Maybe there's certain salmon from certain rivers that would benefit the southern residents more than the other populations, for instance. So maybe we should look at those rivers. The population of the northern resident killer whale uh, has been growing for quite a few years now and growing quite quickly as well. And this also puts prey pressure on the southern residents because they are competing for the same prey. And they're also competing for space as well. And space is something that was also mentioned in this paper quite a bit. And particularly in regards to big orcas, also showing a lot of the space of the southern residents. And the two ecotypes typically avoid each other. Although it's most often the case that bigs will avoid the southern resident killer whales. Now, they also go on to mention the four main factors uh, in 2005 that were cited to being necessary for the recovery of the southern residents. That being prey availability, disturbance from vessels, both physical and acoustic, health effects from environmental contaminants, and the isolated nature of their genetic pool, their gene pool. 'Cause there's very few of them, and the gene pool is not that strong. Let's put it that way. Whereas you could say that other populations or ecotypes of orcas in these same areas share some of these same things. So northern residents, uh, they also would require more available prey. Vessels will also affect them. The environmental contaminants also affect them. And because the size of the population, gene pool less so now, then you can look at pigs who share the same space. Again, it's while they don't share prey, they also share like the vessel disturbance and also the environmental impacts. But yet, quite a considerable number of pigs calves survive quite a bit longer than southern residents. It seems. So I wanted to bring this paper to everyone's attention because sometimes it's important to remember that conservation in a population cannot happen within a vacuum. Because what you do to help one population of orcas is having a positive effect on bigs, also having a positive effect on on northern residents. But the growth of northern residents is also potentially having a bit of a negative effect when it comes to prey availability. And even in competition for space, for instance, where the northern residents are slowly being found more and more south, more and more into the historical territory of the southern residents. So maybe we need to focus more research on why are the northern residents doing so well? And what's the difference between what they're having to deal with and what the southern residents are having to deal with? Also, why are the northern residents coming further south? And concerning the gene pool, um, perhaps the southern residents need to begin outbreeding with like the northern residents or even offshores. But it's much less likely they're going to be doing it with offshores, and definitely less likely with bigs because I mean some people will consider them different species. Um, they are so far apart culturally that there's pretty much that's never really happened. The closest culturally that the southern residents are to is the northern residents. But why don't they outbreed? What about their culture is causing that? And are we having an effect on that? So I should say some of the opinions that I've shared are they're my own opinions. This paper is very factual, but it also speculates on a few scenarios as well that could happen the way we are continuing, including a current recovery scenario. And this would be like best case scenario, and the southern residents do actually start recovering. They'll still have quite a small gene pool, but at least their numbers will be increased. The second scenario that they suggested was called the replacement scenario, where eventually the southern residents would continue to decline, but their niche their niche in those environments will be replaced by the northern residents or the offshores who would kind of take over that range. The third scenario is the extinction scenario. And this is the scenario where the southern residents eventually decline into extinction, and the northern residents and offshores will also decline, and there'll be no more fish eating orcas in the Salish Sea. The fourth potential scenario that they paint is that the southern residents' range overlaps more and more with northern residents and offshores over the years, that eventually they do start outbreeding, and this strengthens the gene pool, and eventually they manage to continue surviving because that effect multiplier is basically a little bit nullified. It's called the genetic rescue scenario. And then the fifth scenario that they point out is that the population fusion scenario, that potentially outbreeding happens will end up happening frequently with the southern residents or northern residents, that eventually they might even create a combined population. So these are speculations that are uh, offered by the paper. And they go on to suggest several different areas of study that might be better suited when you're looking at multiple populations of orcas rather than just one in isolation. Now, the reason why I like this paper, the reason why I wanted to bring attention to it is because sometimes we do have to take a step back and assess, right? Is the research going in the right direction? Are we taking the right actions? Are we is our is our research as recent enough to be able to tell us what the solution is currently? And this is very important because sometimes we can get it wrong. And there have been occasions pretty much all over the world where conservation efforts have kind of taken a turn that we didn't expect. Now, some of them aren't as disastrous as one of the examples that we're going to give in a second, but it can have unintended consequences if we're not evolving our research with the evolution of the problem. So now I'm going to include some parts that me and Gio recorded the other day. So we're going to talk, me and Gio, about a few examples of when there have been conservation efforts that have had different results than what was expected. So, Gio, I think you've got some examples here.
Yeah, so for me being in Florida, I instantly look to the Everglades, but there's plenty of examples of conservation gone wrong here in Florida. But this is a pretty big one. So in 2000, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was an attempt to restore the natural water flow across the Everglades with an original cost projection of $8.2 billion over 30 years. And this was a enacted by the U.S. legislature. Um, in decades past, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had built a number of canals and levees and other flood control measures to reshape the Everglades and open up more land to agriculture and development, as well as making that water available for local municipalities for drinking water and other uses like agriculture. And as well as water transportation for, in particular, sugar producers and phosphate mines. Um, so, additionally, canals and locks have been run from Lake Okeechobee to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico for water access. But that also allowed fresh water to run off directly to the ocean, or more fresh water to run off to the ocean instead of down through the Everglades, which obviously have impacted the water flow and the water quality throughout the Everglades. Progress has been slow, though, with most of the work in the first decade and a half being along the periphery of the Everglades rather than addressing the central core of the Everglades. While water flows have increased, there have been issues with timing and the volume of water flows. Some areas have shown signs of recovery, but others have either stayed stagnant or have gotten worse. A big unintended consequence of increased water flow in the Everglades, though, has led to an increase in habitat and travelways for Burmese pythons and other invasive species without any effective plan in place to reduce their populations, other than organize some hunts every once in a while, I guess. At least that's how it feels to me as a citizen. Like the only thing that we really have out there for controlling the Burmese pythons is people going out and hunting, and they do organize hunts and have contests, once or twice a year that get bunch of people out there hunting, for the biggest and the most, pythons for a week. but we have to have a much more sustained, effort to cover the entirety of the Everglades and eliminate them and prevent more from being, introduced as well, because that still is likely an ongoing problem. Um, but then
So,
beyond that, sugar farms and phosphate mines continue to be one of the big conflicts in Florida ecology, and it especially affects the Everglades. Phosphate contains trace amounts of uranium, and the mines use large settling ponds that are an ecological disaster whenever they leak or break open completely. It wasn't that long ago that the Peace River was inundated by feet thick, sludge after a phosphate settling pond had breached its dam. And especially with the way hurricanes have gone in Florida over the last decade, that's become an even bigger threat. Is them overflowing or breaching during heavy rain events like hurricanes. Um, but on top of that, the sugar farms also use massive amounts of fertilizer, which ironic because the phosphate mines are there to make fertilizer, and a lot of that runoff ends up going into these rivers and canals and into Lake Okeechobee and eventually down into the Gulf and the Atlantic. And because of that, we've often had large algae blooms on Lake Okeechobee. And even when would release water out of Lake Okeechobee to try and flush some of the algae, when that algae hit the salt water at the Gulf and especially on the Gulf side, all of that algae would die. But it would release all of the nitrogen and other nutrients into the water, where then red tide would pick up, which then we had massive blooms of red tide a handful of years ago, and that had a huge impact on the economy of Florida, but also the ecology with so many fish being killed, birds dying, directly from red tide, but also from reduced forage. Same with dolphins and manatees and other, and really any kind of sea life. There's really nothing that survives large red tide algae blooms. It just does so much to just suck oxygen out of the water and suffocate animals, as well as being a respiratory irritant. It's very my experiences with red tide is very much like having the absolute worst like pollen allergies I've ever had in my life, where like my eyes are watering, my nose is getting not just stuffed up, but like mucus is flowing out. My throat is itchy. It's not a fun experience. And so I can't imagine being a dolphin in the water, being, up close and personal to all those neurotoxins and being affected by it. It's pretty horrible. But, there's really all of Everglades problems go back to I think it was the 50s when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in and started making all of those improvements, and it didn't take long for us to figure out the ecological impacts that it had. Of draining so much water and diverting so much water from the Everglades, which is one of the largest watersheds in the world.
yeah, a lot of the time when we have disasters like this, it's because someone or a lot of people haven't thought about all the potential effects this could have. I think it's very important that sometimes conservationists and scientists do take a step back and think, are we on the right track? Because conservation efforts on the southern reservoir have been going on for decades now. And the results not really that convincing. So it makes you wonder, are the conservation efforts in the right place? Are we trying to take the correct actions for conservation? Are we focusing on the correct areas that are harming the southern residents? Because if we focus so much on one particular area with not enough of the research on like the other populations and how they will interact with this change, we might be actually doing them more because If you've got more northern residents, that's more competition for food. And there there's countless examples around the world where people will think that they're doing the right thing, but not think about the big picture. I think another great example is like rabbits in Australia.
Oh, yeah, that's a famous one.
I think that might be one of the most famous ones. And this is also why we really, really don't like invasive species. And when you've got, like, for instance, farmers and they've got a particular type of insect that's attacking their crops, this is why we don't ever want to be thinking, well, let's just introduce a predator, because that predator can have effects that we've not thought of.